An innocent father is sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. His daughter, a fearless attorney, watches in horror as the judge delivers the verdict. The system she believed in has failed her, badly. But just when the world expects her to give up, she does something no one sees coming. She walks to the steps of the Supreme Court, chains herself to the pillars, and vows she won't move until justice is served. The media explodes. The government calls it a stunt. Death threats flood in. But she refuses to back down, because for her father to live, she must be willing to risk it all. What happens when the truth is buried deep, and the only way to expose it is to set the world on fire? Stay with us for a story of defiance, sacrifice, and the battle to save an innocent man before it's too late. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge William Carter adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses, squinting at the papers before him. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches packed with spectators and reporters. Their eager faces reflected the gravity of the moment, some leaning forward in anticipation, others whispering behind cupped hands. Leona Whitmore sat straight-backed beside her father, her hand resting protectively on his arm, feeling the slight tremor in his muscles. Robert's weathered face remained stoic, his military bearing evident even now in the squared set of his shoulders and upright posture. The weight of 15 years of fighting for justice had taken its toll on both of them, visible in the dark circles under their eyes, the tight set of their jaws and the premature streaks of gray in Leona's dark hair. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Carter's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife through butter. Robert stood slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the chains at his ankles. Leona rose with him, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed down her navy suit jacket, a nervous habit she'd developed during the long weeks of the trial. Across the aisle, District Attorney Henry Calloway leaned back in his chair, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth, his expensive silk tie gleaming in the morning light. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress with glasses hanging from a beaded chain, cleared her throat. The rustle of paper seemed deafening in the hushed courtroom, every head turned toward her. "In the matter of the state versus Robert Whitmore, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against Leona's heart. Gasps and excited whispers rippled through the crowd like waves on a pond. Robert's eyes closed, his large hands curling into fists at his sides, the chains between them clinking softly. The muscles in his jaw worked silently, the only sign of his internal struggle. "No!" Leona's voice cracked through the air like summer lightning. "Your Honor, this verdict is based on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution's witness testimony was inconsistent, and the DNA evidence—" "Order!" Judge Carter's gavel crashed down, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. "Ms. Whitmore, control yourself, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." But Leona couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Her words tumbled out, fierce and desperate, her professional composure crumbling like sand. "This is a miscarriage of justice. The senator's real killer is still out there while my father—" "Bailiff!" The judge's face reddened, veins standing out on his neck. "Remove Ms. Whitmore if she continues this outburst." The crowd's reaction grew louder, more hostile, a rising tide of anger. "Cop killer!" someone shouted from the back rows. "Justice for Senator Matthews!" called another, voice thick with vindictive satisfaction. The victim's prominence had turned this trial into a media circus, and now the spectators were getting their show, their pound of flesh. Judge Carter's gavel thundered again, the sound like gunshots in the chaos. "Order in this court!" When the noise subsided to a low murmur, he continued, his voice grave and measured. "Robert Whitmore, given the severity of your crime and the jury's verdict, I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection to be carried out 30 days from today." Cheers erupted from the gallery, a grotesque celebration of death. D.A. Calloway's smile widened as he gathered his papers with practiced efficiency, shooting a smug glance at Leona. His expression clearly said, "I told you you'd lose. I always win." "Don't lose yourself over this, baby girl," Robert whispered, his voice steady despite everything. still the father trying to protect his child. His calloused hand covered Leona's trembling one, warm and familiar. "You've done everything you could." Leona stared at her father's face, the face she'd known all her life, the face that had never shown anything but honesty and integrity, the face that had smiled at her graduations and grimaced through her teenage tantrums, the face of a man about to die for a crime he didn't commit. The bailiffs moved forward to take Robert away, their uniforms crisp and impersonal. The crowd continued their celebration, their joy at seeing justice served filling the courtroom with a carnival atmosphere, a mockery of true justice. Reporters rushed for the doors, eager to break the story of the decorated veteran turned senator's assassin receiving his just punishment, their phones already pressed to their ears. Leona's heels clicked against the marble floor as she strode toward the exit, her fists clenched so tight her manicured nails bit into her palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks. The morning sun still streamed through the windows, but now it felt like a spotlight on their failure, harsh and unforgiving. She paused at the heavy wooden doors, turning back to catch one last glimpse of her father being led away, his head still held high despite the chains. "This isn't over," she vowed, her voice quivering with determination and rage, a daughter's promise to move heaven and earth for justice. The glass doors of Whitmore and Crane's headquarters gleamed in the morning sun as Leona pushed through them. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the lobby, each step echoing with purpose. The security guard nodded at her, probably for the last time, though he didn't know it yet. She managed a small smile in return, remembering all the early mornings they'd exchanged greetings over the years. Inside the elevator, Leona caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from a sleepless night, but her navy suit was crisp and perfect. She'd made sure of that. Today, of all days, she needed to look unshakable. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her jacket, but she forced them still. Weakness wasn't an option. The executive boardroom doors opened to reveal familiar faces around the massive mahogany table. James Crane sat at the head, his silver hair and expensive suit a picture of corporate success. The other partners lined both sides of the table like a jury, fitting given what had happened yesterday. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across their faces. "Leona," Crane said, his voice carefully neutral, "we expected you." His eyes, usually warm with mentorship, had turned to steel. She didn't sit. Instead, she placed her leather briefcase on the table and pulled out a thick folder, her father's case file, worn at the edges from countless nights of review. "I've prepared an outline for the appeal. The police coerced witnesses. There's no physical evidence linking my father to the crime scene. The prosecution's case is built on prejudice and circumstantial evidence." Linda Ralston, seated to Crane's right, tapped her manicured nails against the table. The sound echoed like a countdown. "We all watched the trial, Leona. The jury made their decision." "A wrong decision," Leona shot back, her voice sharp with conviction. "And you all know it." Crane leaned forward, clasping his hands. The gold of his wedding ring caught the light. "You know how the system works, Leona. He's a black man accused of killing a senator. You're not going to win this." The words hung in the air like poison. Leona's hands clenched around the folder, creasing the paper beneath her fingers. "So we just let an innocent man die because of racism? Is that what this firm stands for?" "We stand for smart business decisions," Linda cut in, her voice cold as ice. She straightened her designer glasses with one perfectly manicured finger. "You're emotional. If you push this, you'll destroy your career. Everything you've worked for, gone." Leona looked around the room at the faces she'd known for years. Some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others wore masks of professional detachment. These were the people she'd thought were family, the firm that carried her name. The betrayal tasted bitter in her mouth. "Then I don't want this career." The words came out clear and strong. Leona reached for her ID badge, the plastic warm from resting against her heart. She ripped it from her lapel and tossed it onto the table. It skidded across the polished surface, coming to rest in front of Crane like an accusation. Gasps rippled through the room. Linda's mouth fell open. Even Crane's composed facade cracked for a moment, his eyes widening in surprise. "Leona," he started, rising slightly from his chair. "Don't throw away everything you've built." "I'm not throwing anything away," she cut him off, chin held high. "I'm choosing justice over profit. Maybe you should try it sometime." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving her briefcase and the appeal documents on the table like a final statement. The click of her heels echoed through the hallway one last time as she made her way to the elevator, each step carrying her further from the life she'd known and closer to the fight ahead. The morning sun hit her face as she pushed through the glass doors into the street. For the first time in years, she had no job, no safety net, just a mission. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders, but beneath it burned a fierce determination. Her father needed her, and she wouldn't let him down. The neon beer signs cast a reddish glow across the worn wooden tables of O'Malley's bar, their steady hum a quiet backdrop to the afternoon lull. Leona sat in a corner booth, her untouched gin and tonic leaving expanding rings of condensation on the scratched table surface. Her navy suit jacket was wrinkled from a sleepless night spent poring over case files, and dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises. But her gaze remained sharp, focused on the door, watching each patron who entered with unwavering attention. At exactly 2 p.m., Darnell Hayes pushed through the entrance, bringing with him a gust of warm city air. His leather jacket was weathered, much like his face, carved with deep lines from years of seeing too much on the force. The jacket squeaked softly as he moved. He spotted Leona immediately and made his way over, his slight limp barely noticeable against the creaking floorboards. "You look terrible," he said, sliding into the booth with a grunt. "Thanks." Leona's voice was dry as autumn leaves. "Did you get it?" Darnell didn't answer immediately. He signaled the bartender for a coffee, black, his thick fingers drumming quietly on the table. The afternoon crowd was thin. A couple of regulars hunched at the bar nursing their beers, a businessman in a rumpled suit typing furiously on his laptop while muttering to himself. Perfect for a quiet conversation about dangerous things. "I did better than get it," Darnell finally said, his voice low and gravelly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges and slightly creased at the corners. "I got him to sign it in front of a notary." Leona's hands trembled slightly as she took the folder, her manicured nails catching the neon light. Inside was a formal affidavit, the paper still crisp and official-looking. Her eyes scanned the text, growing wider with each damning paragraph. "I, Terrence Lyle, hereby swear under penalty of perjury," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper, each word weighted with significance. "Detective Marcus Sanders threatened to arrest my brother on drug charges if I didn't testify against Robert Whitmore. The statement I gave in court was false. I never saw Robert Whitmore near Senator Thompson's office on the night of the murder." "Keep reading," Darnell urged, accepting his steaming coffee from the waitress with a grateful nod. Leona flipped the page, the paper crackling under her fingers. "They coached me on what to say. D.A. Calloway was present during 2 of these meetings." Her breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God, Darnell." "Terrence is scared," Darnell said, leaning forward until his elbows rested on the sticky table. His coffee sat forgotten, wisps of steam curling into the air between them. "But he's more scared of living with this guilt. He's got kids of his own now. Says he can't look them in the eye knowing he helped send an innocent man to death row." Leona's hands were shaking so hard she had to set the papers down on the table. "This is it. This is what we needed." She grabbed her phone from her purse, fingers flying over the screen as she pulled up the courthouse number, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Judge Carter's office," a bored voice answered, the words slightly muffled. "This is Leona Whitmore. I need to schedule an emergency appeal hearing for Robert Whitmore immediately. I have new evidence. A key witness has recanted his testimony." Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. There was a long pause, followed by the rapid clicking of keyboard keys. "The judge has an opening tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. "I'll be there." Leona hung up and looked at Darnell, her eyes bright with unshed tears that caught the neon light. "How did you find him?" "Let's just say I still have friends who remember what it means to serve justice, not just convictions." Darnell took a slow sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. Be careful, Leona. People are going to try to bury this. Let them try. She carefully tucked the affidavit back into the folder and stood up, grabbing her purse with renewed purpose. Her drink remained untouched on the table, the ice slowly melting into the tonic. Outside, the afternoon sun was harsh after the bar's dimness, making her squint against its glare. Leona raised her arm, and a yellow cab pulled up to the curb with a squeal of brakes. She clutched the folder to her chest like a shield, feeling its edges press against her racing heart. For the first time since the verdict, she felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Hope. It was fragile, like a butterfly's wing, but it was there, fluttering with possibility. The marble floors of the courthouse echoed under Leona's determined steps as she made her way to Judge Carter's chambers. Her navy blazer was pressed, her hair neatly pulled back, and her black pencil skirt perfectly tailored, every detail calculated to project authority and competence. The affidavit felt heavy in her leather portfolio, like it carried the weight of her father's life, each page representing another chance at justice that she couldn't afford to waste. Judge Carter barely glanced up from his desk when she entered, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and stacks of case files surrounded him like a paper fortress, each one representing another life hanging in the balance. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast harsh shadows across his stern face, highlighting every wrinkle earned from years of passing judgment. "Your Honor," Leona said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The familiar scent of old books and leather chairs filled her nostrils. "I have new evidence that proves my father's innocence." She placed the affidavit on his desk, right on top of the file he was reading, her hand lingering for a moment on the crucial document. Judge Carter sighed heavily and picked up the document with obvious reluctance, his weathered fingers turning each page with deliberate slowness. The silence stretched as he flipped through the pages, his expression unchanging like carved stone. Finally, he looked up at her over his glasses. "This changes nothing." "It proves my father was framed." Leona's carefully maintained composure cracked, her voice rising with desperate intensity. "Terrence Lyle admits under oath that the police forced him to lie. How can you ignore that?" The heavy wooden door creaked open, and District Attorney Henry Calloway strolled in, an unlit cigar dangling from his manicured fingers. His expensive charcoal suit and perfectly styled silver hair radiated smug confidence, every inch of him projecting power and control. "Having a little morning chat, are we?" "Mr. Calloway," Judge Carter nodded, a hint of relief in his voice. "Perfect timing." Leona's jaw clenched as Calloway circled around her like a shark, his polished shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. "You think one affidavit can overturn a death sentence?" He chuckled, the sound grating against her nerves like sandpaper. How naive. Judge Carter reached for his stamp, the metal gleaming dully in the morning light. The loud thunk of "denied" hitting the appeal papers made Leona flinch, the red ink seeming to mock her efforts. Calloway pulled out a gold lighter and lit a cigar, filling the room with sweet-smelling smoke that made her stomach turn. "Your father is already a dead man. Accept it. Move on." He blew a perfect smoke ring in Leona's direction, the gray circle floating between them like a twisted halo. "Maybe focus on clients who are actually innocent." Leona's hands trembled with rage as she gathered her papers, her fingers white-knuckled around the portfolio's leather edges. The system she'd dedicated her life to defending now felt like a maze designed to trap the innocent. Every corridor led to the same dead end, every door locked by men like Calloway who held all the keys and wielded them like weapons. She stormed out of the judge's chambers, her heels striking the floor like hammer blows against her shattered faith in justice. The fury bubbling inside her threatened to explode, but she held it in check until she reached the courthouse steps. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged to kill her father. And the men behind it weren't even trying to hide their corruption anymore, their arrogance as suffocating as Calloway's cigar smoke. The harsh buzz of her phone jolted Leona awake. Sunlight streamed through her apartment windows as she squinted at the screen. 23 missed calls and 47 text messages. Her head pounded from another sleepless night spent reviewing case files. the scattered papers still strewn across her coffee table where she'd finally collapsed from exhaustion. When her phone buzzed again, she recognized Darnell's number. "Hello?" she answered, her voice still rough with sleep, her throat dry and scratchy. "Turn on the news," Darnell said without preamble. His usually gruff voice carried an edge of urgency that made her stomach clench. She'd never heard him sound this worried before. Leona fumbled for the TV remote, clicking through channels until she found the local news. A polished anchor with perfectly coiffed hair spoke directly into the camera, her expression grave. "Breaking news this morning. The execution date for Robert Whitmore, convicted of murdering Senator James Harrison, has been officially set for 30 days from today. The decision comes after years of appeals." The remote slipped from Leona's numb fingers and clattered to the floor. She was dressed and out the door within minutes, not even bothering to brush her hair or grab breakfast, her heart hammering against her ribs as she drove to the courthouse through the morning traffic. The clerk's office was quiet when she burst in, demanding answers. The woman behind the desk barely looked up from her computer screen as she handed over a single sheet of paper, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Leona's eyes fixed on the stark black text. "The execution order has been approved." Her father's name stood out like an accusation. Rage propelled her through the courthouse halls until she reached D.A. Calloway's office. She didn't bother knocking, pushing the heavy door open with enough force to make it bang against the wall, the sound echoing through the marble corridor. Calloway sat behind his massive mahogany desk, perfectly composed in his expensive charcoal suit. He didn't even look up from the document he was reading, his silver pen tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. "Miss Whitmore, I'm assuming you've heard the news." "You just sentenced an innocent man to death." Leona slammed the execution order onto his desk, scattering his carefully arranged papers across the pristine surface. Calloway finally looked up, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he reached for his silver cigar case. He took his time selecting one, clipping the end with practiced precision, his movements deliberately slow and casual. "Welcome to the real world, sweetheart." The patronizing tone made Leona's blood boil. She watched as he lit the cigar, the smoke curling lazily in the air between them like a physical barrier. His smug satisfaction was like a physical blow, each puff of smoke another reminder of his complete control over the situation. She stormed out of his office, her hands trembling so badly she could barely grip her phone. In the courthouse lobby, surrounded by the quiet murmur of morning business, she scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she hadn't dialed in years. Judge Marilyn Reed, the woman who had once been her fiercest advocate in law school, who had warned her about the corruption in the system, the same mentor she'd arrogantly dismissed when she'd landed her cushy corporate job. Back then, Leona had been so sure she knew better. Leona's finger hovered over the call button, pride warring with desperation. The marble walls of justice suddenly felt more like a prison. Taking a deep breath, she pressed dial. The dim glow of Leona's desk lamp cast long shadows across her apartment walls, creating an eerie dance of light and darkness. Legal papers covered every surface, scattered like fallen leaves in autumn, each one representing another piece of the complex puzzle she was trying to solve. Empty coffee cups formed a small army on her desk, evidence of her sleepless dedication, their brown rings staining the scattered documents beneath them. Her usually neat apartment had transformed into a war room, with sticky notes plastered on walls and red string connecting newspaper clippings like a spider's web of conspiracy. Leona's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard with desperate intensity, her eyes burning from staring at the screen for hours on end. She hadn't bothered to eat all day. The thought of food made her stomach turn with anxiety. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, making her look years older than she was, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when her father's life ticked away like a countdown clock, each second bringing him closer to the end. A sharp knock at the door broke her concentration, echoing through the quiet apartment. She ignored it, diving deeper into a legal precedent that might help her case, her heart racing at each potentially useful detail. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, the hollow sound reverberating through her bones. "Leona! Open up! I know you're in there." Isaac's voice. Her brother. Leona sighed heavily, pushing back from her desk. Her joints cracked like brittle twigs as she stood. She'd been sitting too long, lost in her research. She opened the door to find Isaac standing there, his medical textbooks tucked under one arm, his white coat still on from his hospital rotation. His face was tight with worry and anger, his usually warm eyes cold with concern. "You look terrible," he said, pushing past her into the apartment. He stopped short at the sight of the chaos, his mouth falling open. "What is all this?" "Research," Leona said, closing the door with a soft click. "I'm building Dad's appeal. Every piece matters." Isaac picked up a newspaper clipping about police corruption, his hands trembling slightly as he read the headline. "Leona, you need to stop." "Stop?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a hollow, bitter sound. "Stop trying to save our father's life? Stop putting yourself in danger." Isaac slammed the clipping down onto the cluttered desk. "You quit your job, you're digging into corrupt cops, challenging powerful people who won't hesitate to fight back. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" Leona crossed her arms, her stance defensive and unyielding. "If I stop, he dies. It's that simple. And if you don't stop, you might die too." Isaac ran his hands through his disheveled hair in frustration, his medical student composure cracking. "These people, they killed a senator, Leona. They framed Dad. What do you think they'll do to you if they feel threatened?" "So what's your solution?" Leona's voice rose, echoing off the walls. "Just let them execute him? Pretend everything's fine while they murder our father in cold blood? We need to be smart about this." Isaac's voice matched hers in intensity. "Work within the system, file proper appeals, use legal channels." "The system is broken!" Leona grabbed the execution notice from her desk, the paper crumpling in her tight grip as she waved it in his face. "They're going to kill him in 30 days. The system doesn't care about justice, it only cares about protecting itself. And getting yourself killed will help?" Isaac grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging in desperately. "Think about what this is doing to the family. To Mom, to me. We can't lose you too." Leona jerked away from him, her body rigid with anger. "I am thinking about family. I'm thinking about Dad rotting in prison for a crime he didn't commit." "No, you're thinking about revenge." Isaac's words cut through the air like a knife, sharp and precise. "You're so obsessed with fighting the system, you can't see what it's doing to you. You're destroying yourself. Get out." Leona's voice was ice cold, each word sharp as frozen daggers. "Leona, get out." Isaac stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with pain and frustration, the weight of their broken relationship visible in his stance. Then he turned and stormed to the door, yanking it open with enough force to rattle the walls. "When you've destroyed everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "don't say I didn't warn you." The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. Leona grabbed her phone and hurled it against the wall with a primal scream of frustration. It hit with a sharp crack, falling to the floor in pieces. She stood there, breathing hard, her hands clenched into fists, her whole body trembling with rage and determination. Then she stopped, her body going still as stone. Her eyes narrowed with sudden clarity. She knew what she had to do next. The path ahead was dangerous, but she had no choice. Her father's life depended on it. The frigid morning air nipped at Leona's face as she stood resolute before the towering Supreme Court building, its imposing presence mirroring the weight of her purpose. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the gravity of what she was about to do. The heavy metal chain clinked softly in her grip, drawing curious glances from passing tourists and early morning joggers who paused to witness this unfolding scene. The somber gray sky hung low, perfectly reflecting Leona's solemn mood. She took a deep, steadying breath, her determination unwavering. Without hesitation, she wrapped the thick chain around one of the massive marble pillars, then secured it tightly around her own waist. The cold metal felt like an embrace, a physical manifestation of her commitment to the cause. A security guard was the first to notice, his eyes widening as he rushed down the steps. "Ma'am, you can't do that here. Remove the chain immediately," he demanded. Leona stood taller, her voice clear and strong. "I'm not moving." Her words echoed with a quiet resolve that belied the intensity of her convictions. More people stopped to stare, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding events. The security guard spoke urgently into his radio, calling for backup. Within minutes, reporters began arriving, their camera flashes illuminating the gloomy morning like intermittent lightning. Leona recognized many of the faces from her father's trial, and she knew they were now here to witness her act of defiance. Stepping forward, Leona projected her voice, ensuring every camera and microphone captured her words. "My name is Leona Whitmore. My father, Robert Whitmore, has been sentenced to die for a crime he didn't commit. The courts won't listen, the governor won't listen, but I will not move. Not until the world hears the truth." The crowd swelled, some cheering in support, raising their fists, while others shouted angry words, demanding that she leave. Police cars arrived, their lights painting the scene in a pulsing red and blue. A megaphone-wielding officer issued a final warning: "Remove yourself from the premises or face arrest." Leona remained steadfast, her gaze unwavering. "My father served this country in Vietnam. He worked 2 jobs to put me through law school. He's innocent, and I have proof. But nobody will look at the evidence. Nobody will listen." News vans pulled up one after another, live feeds broadcasting her protest across the city, the state, and then the country. Social media exploded with videos and photos, the hashtag number Free Robert Whitmore quickly gaining traction. The growing crowd of supporters formed a protective circle around Leona, their voices rising in a chant: "Free Robert Whitmore! Free Robert Whitmore!" Leona's phone buzzed in her pocket and she glanced at the screen to see a statement from the governor's office, calling her actions reckless and irresponsible. Undeterred, she tucked the phone away, gripping the chain tighter. A light drizzle began to fall, but Leona remained unmoved, her resolve as unyielding as the metal that bound her to the pillar. The chain felt heavy against her body, but not as heavy as the weight of injustice that had brought her here. She thought of her father alone in his cell, counting down the days, and of Isaac's angry words from the night before. But most of all, she thought of the truth, and how far she would go to make anyone listen. The crowd continued to grow, their voices rising above the rain. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Leona stayed focused. She had made her stand, and now the world would have to pay attention. The evening chill crept through Leona's thin blazer as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her muscles screamed in protest after standing for nearly 12 hours, chained to the courthouse's cold marble pillars. The metal links bit into her skin, a constant reminder of her choice. She flexed her fingers, trying to keep the blood flowing as another shiver ran through her body. "They're calling you the lawyer who won't move," a young journalist whispered, leaning in close. His breath smelled of coffee and mint, his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "Social media's exploding. You're making serious waves. People are sharing your story across the country." Leona glanced at her phone screen, which hadn't stopped lighting up since morning. Thousands of notifications flooded in, some supportive messages, others filled with hate. Her fingers were nearly numb as she scrolled through them, each buzz a reminder of the growing attention her protest was receiving. A hush fell over the crowd as breaking news flashed across everyone's phones. Governor Nathaniel Brooks had called an emergency press conference. Leona held her breath, watching the live stream on her device, her heart pounding against her ribs. The governor's face filled the screen, his steel gray hair perfectly coiffed, his expression stern. His expensive suit and flag pin gleamed under the press room lights. "We do not negotiate with theatrics," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The justice system has spoken. Ms. Whitmore's desperate attempt to circumvent due process only demonstrates why we need law and order." Leona's jaw clenched so tight it hurt. She knew Brooks. He'd been at countless fundraisers at Whitmore and Crane, always ready with a practiced smile and firm handshake. He'd shaken her hand, praised her work, called her the future of justice in our state. Now he wouldn't even say her first name. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message made her blood run cold. You've made a mistake, Leona. Walk away while you still can. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it again. She quickly scanned the crowd, searching for watching eyes. The sea of faces offered no clues. Journalists with their cameras, curious onlookers with their phones, police officers standing at a distance, their hands resting casually on their belts. Any one of them could have sent the message. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. The crowd had thinned, but cameras still rolled, capturing her every move. Her body ached, her stomach growled with hunger pangs, and her wrists were raw from the chains. But as she looked up at the imposing building before her, its classical architecture looming against the darkening sky, she thought of her father sitting in his cell, counting down the days until his execution. "Let them come," she whispered, gripping the cold metal chain tighter until her knuckles turned white. Her words disappeared into the night air, but her resolve hardened like steel. The anonymous threat had only confirmed what she already suspected. She was getting close to something bigger than her father's case, something that made powerful people nervous. A police officer approached, his flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. His boots echoed against the stone steps. "Ms. Whitmore, this is your final warning. We'll have to remove you by force." Leona met his gaze steadily, lifting her chin. "I'm not moving," she said, loud enough for the remaining cameras to pick up, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not until justice is served." The officer shook his head and stepped back, speaking into his radio. More threats, more warnings. But Leona had stopped listening. She'd made her choice. The chain around her was no longer just metal. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the system she'd once believed in, once defended so passionately in courtrooms just like this one. As night settled over the city, Leona stood her ground, her shadow merging with the darkness. The anonymous threat lingered in her mind, but instead of fear, she felt a grim satisfaction. Someone was worried enough to try to scare her away, which meant she was right where she needed to be, no matter the cost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where Leona Whitmore lay curled against the cold stone, her wrists still bound by heavy chains. Her designer suit, once crisp and pristine, was now wrinkled and stained with dirt and sweat. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of a sleepless night spent under the harsh glare of news cameras and the unforgiving downtown streetlights. "Ms. Whitmore, Ms. Whitmore!" The reporters crowded closer, their microphones thrust toward her like accusing fingers, their voices a chaotic chorus of demands. "How long do you plan to continue this protest? What do you say to those who claim you're just seeking attention?" Leona pushed herself up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest from hours spent on the hard concrete. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her head throbbed with dehydration, but she forced herself to speak clearly and firmly. "I won't move until my father's execution is overturned. Not one step. Not until justice is served." The morning crowd had already begun to gather, growing larger with each passing minute. Business people in suits stopped to stare, some taking photos with their phones, others shaking their heads in disapproval. A group of college students, their faces bright with passion and purpose, held up hastily made signs reading, "Free Robert Whitmore," and "Justice Now." Some had even brought sleeping bags and thermoses, settling in for a long vigil. "She's so brave," a young woman whispered to her friend, clutching her coffee cup with both hands, "standing up to the whole system like that." "She's just looking for attention," an older man in an expensive suit scoffed, his gold watch glinting in the morning light. "The courts made their decision. This is nothing but theater." Security officers huddled near the courthouse entrance, speaking in hushed tones and casting uncertain glances in Leona's direction, clearly uncomfortable with the growing spectacle. Finally, Officer Jennings, a veteran of the courthouse security team, broke away from the group and approached her. His face was kind, his movements careful, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any moment. "Ms. Whitmore," he said softly, kneeling beside her on aging knees. "I understand what you're trying to do here, but you need to eat something. You're making yourself sick." There are better ways to fight this battle. Leona met his concerned gaze with steely determination, though her vision blurred slightly at the edges. "Thank you for your concern, Officer Jennings, but I can't do that. This is the only way they'll listen." The reporters pressed closer, their cameras clicking frantically like hungry insects. "Breaking news!" one shouted into his microphone, his voice trembling with excitement. "Leona Whitmore refuses food and water as her protest continues into its second day. The daughter of death row inmate Robert Whitmore remains chained to the courthouse steps." Social media exploded with updates, notifications pinging on thousands of phones across the city. Justice for Whitmore climbed trending lists, accompanied by passionate debates and viral posts. Video clips of Leona's protests spread like wildfire, sparking heated discussions about justice, corruption, and the death penalty in comment sections and news feeds everywhere. In his plush office overlooking the city, District Attorney Henry Calloway watched the news coverage with growing rage, his perfectly manicured hands shaking with anger. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup as Leona's face appeared on the screen again, her determination evident even through her exhaustion. "Turn that garbage off," he snapped at his assistant, who scrambled to comply. Rising from his leather desk chair, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and glared down at the growing crowd below, their signs visible even from this height. She thinks she can win this with public sympathy, with this little publicity stunt. His lip curled in disgust. He grabbed his phone, punching in numbers with sharp jabs that betrayed his fury. "Get me the governor's office. Now this ends today." Back on the courthouse steps, Leona's head swam with exhaustion and hunger, the world tilting dangerously whenever she moved too quickly. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and her throat ached for water, every swallow feeling like glass. But every time she felt her resolve weaken, she thought of her father in his prison cell, counting down the days until his execution, and her determination hardened like steel. Officer Jennings appeared again, this time with a bottle of water, condensation beading on its surface. "Please, ma'am, just a sip. You're going to collapse if you keep this up." Leona closed her eyes, steadying herself against a wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. The chains felt heavier with each passing hour, the metal biting into her skin, but her determination grew stronger. If she had to starve for justice, so be it. Her father's life was worth any sacrifice. The evening air grew chilly as Leona struggled to push herself upright against the courthouse pillar, her handcuffed wrists scraping against the rough stone. Her vision swam, dark spots dancing before her eyes like angry fireflies. 36 hours without food or water had taken their toll, leaving her weaker than she'd ever felt. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her stomach had long since stopped growling, settling into a constant, hollow ache that seemed to reach her very bones. Through blurred vision, she saw a familiar figure approaching. James Crane, immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the fading light like polished sterling. He knelt beside her, his expensive cologne overwhelming her sensitive senses and making her head spin even more. "Leona, you made your point. Now get up before you ruin yourself." His voice was stern, but carried a hint of genuine concern, the same tone he'd used when mentoring her as a young associate. She managed a weak smile, though it cost her energy she didn't have. "Not until they review my father's case." James sighed heavily, adjusting his silk tie with manicured fingers. "The firm's board met this morning. We're officially severing all ties with you. Your partnership is dissolved, effective immediately. I fought for you, but the decision was unanimous." "You're not a lawyer anymore, Leona. You're an activist." The words stung like salt in an open wound, but she refused to let it show on her face, channeling every ounce of courtroom composure she had left. Around them, the crowd had grown into a restless sea of bodies. Some held hand-painted signs supporting her cause, their messages of hope and justice lifted high, while others jeered and called her names that echoed off the courthouse walls. News vans lined the street like vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky like metallic fingers. On a nearby TV screen mounted to one of the news trucks, a news anchor's voice cut through the evening air. Questions arise about Leona Whitmore's credibility as her former law firm distances itself from her protest. Critics call it a publicity stunt, while supporters claim this shows the depths of systemic corruption. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, the screen lighting up her pale face. The governor's office had released another statement. Ms. Whitmore is engaging in a reckless and performative act. The law is the law, and no amount of theatrical protest will change established legal procedure. The crowd's energy shifted like a brewing storm. A group of protesters began chanting, "Justice for Whitmore," while others shouted back, "Law and order." The tension in the air was palpable, crackling like electricity before lightning strikes. James stood up, brushing off his perfectly pressed pants with deliberate motions. "Don't throw away everything you've worked for, Leona. This isn't how the system works. You know that better than anyone." With trembling fingers, Leona pulled up the Whitmore and Crane website on her phone, the screen blurring in and out of focus. She watched as her profile disappeared from the Partners page, erased with a single click like she'd never existed. Years of cases, victories, and achievements, gone in an instant, reduced to nothing but cached web pages and fading memories. She exhaled slowly, feeling the cold metal of the chains against her wrists bite deeper into her skin. The decision had already been made. Sealed with each passing hour, she remained chained to these pillars. There was no going back now, even if she wanted to. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Leona as she slumped against the courthouse pillar. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. 2 days without food or water had left her weak, her thoughts sluggish and scattered. The stone behind her back offered little comfort, but it was all that kept her upright now. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Through bleary eyes, she read Isaac's text, "Turn on the news." Her fingers trembled as she gripped the device tighter. A kind-faced reporter in the crowd held up her phone, showing a live broadcast. Leona's heart dropped. There was Isaac, standing at a podium outside the hospital where he worked as a medical resident. His white coat was crisp and clean, his expression pained but determined. The hospital's familiar red brick facade loomed behind him, a stark contrast to his pale face. "I love my sister," Isaac's voice cracked slightly. "But she's risking her life for something that won't change. As a medical professional, I can tell you that prolonged fasting is dangerous. She's already showing signs of severe dehydration." His medical training made every word carry extra weight, cutting deeper into Leona's resolve. Leona's hands trembled as she watched. The chain around her waist felt heavier than ever, the metal links biting into her skin through the thin fabric of her shirt. "Dr. Whitmore," a reporter shouted from the crowd, "are you asking your sister to stop her protest?" Isaac's face twisted with emotion. He gripped the podium edges, knuckles white. The pause seemed to stretch forever before he finally nodded. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the hospital's air conditioning washing over him. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I am." The media exploded with questions. Headlines started scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Family divided. Brother pleads with protesting sister to end hunger strike." And medical expert warns, Leona Whitmore risking her life. Each word felt like another blow to her already fragile state. Tears burned in Leona's eyes. She could almost hear her father's voice. "Don't lose yourself over this, baby girl." But wasn't that exactly what she was doing? Losing her job, her reputation, her brother's support. Piece by piece, everything was slipping away. The weight of each loss pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The crowd around her had grown. Some whispered and pointed, their eyes full of pity. Others shook their heads in disapproval. A nearby reporter spoke into her microphone. Even her own family is now speaking out against what many are calling a desperate and futile gesture. The words echoed off the courthouse walls, amplifying their impact. Leona's stomach cramped painfully, though she wasn't sure if it was from hunger or heartbreak. The chain felt like it was suffocating her. For the first time since she'd started this protest, doubt crept in. Was she really throwing everything away for nothing? The question haunted her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her phone kept buzzing with messages and calls, but she couldn't bear to look at them. With shaking hands, she turned it off completely. The silence felt both peaceful and terrifying, broken only by the whispers of the growing crowd. Leaning back against the cold pillar, Leona closed her eyes. Her lips, cracked and dry, moved in a whisper that only she could hear. Not yet. The words carried both defiance and desperation. A prayer and a promise rolled into one. The midnight air wrapped around Leona like a cold blanket as she dozed against the courthouse pillar. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago, replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to reach into her bones. The chain clinked softly as she shifted, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. The concrete steps had long since leached away any warmth, leaving her muscles stiff and protesting. Her phone's harsh buzz jolted her awake. The screen showed an unknown number, its bright light painful against the darkness. With trembling fingers, she answered. "Hello." A deep voice, digitally altered, crackled through the speaker. "Your father is innocent, but they'll never let him live." The words came out mechanical, inhuman, each syllable carefully distorted. Leona's heart jumped into her throat. She pressed the phone closer to her ear, suddenly wide awake. Her free hand gripped the chain binding her to the pillar. "What? Who is this?" "They needed someone to take the fall. Your father was perfect, a black veteran with a temper. They built the case around him." The voice carried a hint of something, regret maybe, or fear, even through the digital manipulation. "Tell me who you are," Leona demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Despite her exhaustion, her mind raced, cataloging every detail of the caller's words. "What do you know about my father's case?" The voice continued as if she hadn't spoken. The senator knew too much. They couldn't risk him talking. Each word fell like a stone into the quiet night. "Who are they?" Leona pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear herself speak. "Please, I need to know." The line went dead with a sharp click. Leona's hands shook as she tried to redial the number. Nothing. No ring, no voicemail, just silence. She tried again and again, each attempt met with the same emptiness. The screen mockingly displayed, "Call failed" with each try. A cold breeze swept across the courthouse steps, but the shiver that ran through Leona's body had nothing to do with the temperature. Her mind spun with the implications. This wasn't just about a wrongful conviction. This wasn't just about racism in the justice system. Someone had deliberately chosen her father, framed him, and now they were determined to see him die. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more sinister than she'd imagined. The few reporters still camped out nearby stirred at her sudden movement, their cameras catching the moonlight as they turned toward her. But Leona barely noticed them. Her fingers gripped her phone so tight her knuckles turned white. The mysterious caller had meant to frighten her, to show her how deep this conspiracy went. But they had miscalculated. Instead of fear, Leona felt rage burning through her exhaustion, filling her with renewed purpose. They had picked her father because they thought he was powerless. They thought no one would fight for him. They thought wrong. Her father had raised her to stand up against injustice, and she wouldn't fail him now. She looked up at the towering courthouse, its shadows stretching across the steps like prison bars in the moonlight. The massive building loomed over her, a monument to power and corruption. Somewhere in there, hidden in files and buried evidence, lay the truth. And now she knew, really knew, it was worth dying for. The chain rattled as she straightened her spine, the sound echoing in the quiet night like a declaration of war. Let them come. Let them try to stop her. She would tear their whole corrupt system down before she let them kill her father. Their carefully constructed lies wouldn't survive her determination to expose the truth. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Leona as she leaned against the cold courthouse pillar, her designer suit wrinkled and stained from days in a holding cell. Her head felt light, and black spots danced in her vision, making the marble steps swim before her eyes. 3 days without food had taken their toll, leaving her weak and dizzy. The chain around her waist clinked as she shifted, trying to stay alert despite her exhaustion. The irony wasn't lost on her. A former defense attorney, now chained like a common criminal on these very steps where she'd once commanded respect. A shadow fell across her face, offering brief relief from the harsh sunlight. A young woman in a pressed blazer crouched next to her, dark eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses, her notebook clutched protectively against her chest. "I'm Maya Torres from the Daily Chronicle," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder at the courthouse security guards who lounged nearby. "I have something for you." Before Leona could respond, Maya pressed a small flash drive into her palm, her movements quick and practiced. The metal felt warm against her skin, like it carried the weight of secrets within its tiny frame. "What is this?" Leona's voice came out raspy from dehydration, her throat raw and painful. Maya's eyes darted around the crowded steps, checking for anyone who might be watching too closely. "Proof your father was framed." Leona's heart skipped a beat, then started racing. She closed her fingers around the drive, concealing it in her palm. "How did you—" "Not here," Maya cut her off, her voice urgent but barely above a whisper. "You need to hear this somewhere safe." 20 minutes later, Leona sat in Darnell Hayes's cramped office, the chain finally off her waist, leaving angry red marks on her skin. Her hands trembled as she plugged the flash drive into his ancient laptop, the anticipation making her fingers clumsy. Maya and Darnell crowded behind her chair, their breath warm on her neck as she clicked on the single audio file. Static crackled through the speakers, then a man's voice emerged, slurred with alcohol and heavy with guilt. "I swear, man, I didn't mean to kill him. I just did what they told me. It wasn't supposed to go down like that." Leona's breath caught in her throat, her heart nearly stopping. She knew that voice. Everyone in political circles knew that voice. It had been featured in countless campaign ads and charity galas. "Eric Wallace," Darnell muttered, naming the senator's son, his voice thick with disgust. The recording continued, Eric's words tumbling out in a drunken confession that could change everything. Leona's hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. Here was the real killer, living in luxury while her father was sitting on death row for his crime. Maya touched Leona's shoulder gently, her fingers warm and reassuring. "It's not enough to clear him yet, but it's a start." Leona stared at the screen, her heart pounding against her ribs like it wanted to break free. The real murderer had been right in front of them all along, the privileged son of a powerful family, protected by his father's influence and money. But would anyone believe her? Would this be enough to save her father's life? Or would the Wallace family's influence bury this evidence like they'd buried everything else? She replayed the recording, letting Eric Wallace's guilty words fill the silent office once more, each syllable another crack in the wall of lies they'd built around her father's case. The neon sign of Joe's all-night diner flickered against the rain-streaked windows. Leona sat across from Darnell in a worn vinyl booth, pushing cold coffee around in her cup. The recording from the flash drive played softly through her phone's speaker, Eric Wallace's drunken confession repeating for the 12th time. Darnell rubbed his tired eyes. "Even if you go public, Wallace is protected. We need physical proof, something that ties him to the crime scene." Leona's fingers tightened around her cup. The original police report, the one that mysteriously vanished after Dad's arrest. "And who has that?" "Senator Frank Reynolds." Leona's jaw clenched. He was in charge of the initial investigation before it got handed to Calloway. "You can't be serious." Darnell leaned forward. "Breaking into a senator's house? That's suicide." But Leona was already grabbing her coat. 20 minutes later, she pulled up to Reynolds's sprawling estate, her heart pounding against her ribs. The security cameras were easy to avoid. She'd studied the blind spots for weeks. The back door's lock took longer, her hands shaking as she worked the pick. Inside, the house was silent except for the tick of an antique grandfather clock. Leona crept through dark hallways, following the floor plan she'd memorized. Reynolds' study door stood slightly ajar, moonlight spilling across rich mahogany furniture. She slipped inside, scanning filing cabinets and bookshelves. Nothing. Her flashlight beam caught the edge of a wall safe behind a painting. Looking for something? The lights clicked on. Senator Reynolds stood in the doorway, silver hair gleaming, cold eyes fixed on her. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Ms. Whitmore?" He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Leona's mouth went dry. Reynolds walked to his desk, tapping his fingers on a thick manila folder. "You're looking for this, aren't you?" Her pulse skipped. The missing police report, right there in front of her. Reynolds smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If you think you can threaten me into giving you this?" He opened the folder, revealing photos and documents she'd never seen. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Leona took a step forward. "That report proves my father's innocent." "Perhaps." Reynolds closed the folder. "But you'll never see it. The system works exactly as it's meant to, Ms. Whitmore. Your father's conviction keeps certain people very happy." He leaned forward, pressing his palms against the desk. "Walk away now, Leona, or your father won't be the only one who dies." The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across Senator Reynolds' estate as Leona sat in her parked car, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was clear. She pulled out her phone and dialed Maya's number. "We need to force his hand," Leona said without preamble. Maya's voice crackled through the speaker. "Are you sure about this? Reynolds isn't someone you want as an enemy." "I don't have a choice. My father's running out of time." 20 minutes later, Leona walked confidently through the mahogany doors of Reynolds' office. The tiny recording device Maya had given her felt heavy in her jacket pocket. Reynolds looked up from his desk, his face twisting into a sneer. "Back so soon?" he asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "I thought our conversation last night was quite clear." Leona kept her voice steady. "I want the report. I'll give you something in return." Reynolds chuckled, the sound dry and hollow. "And what do you have to offer?" She pulled out her phone and pressed play. Eric Wallace's drunken confession filled the room. Reynolds' face darkened as he listened. Leona leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "I have Wallace's confession. If I go public, your entire career goes up in flames. Every deal you've made, every favor you've traded, it all comes crashing down." Reynolds' jaw clenched. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly as he considered his options. Finally, he yanked open his desk drawer and pulled out a worn manila folder. "Take it," he growled, throwing it onto the desk. "But if you breathe a word about where you got it, I'll bury you." Leona picked up the folder, her heart racing. Inside were the original police reports, complete with time-stamped photos showing Eric Wallace's car at the scene. "We never had this conversation," Reynolds said, his voice cold. "Wouldn't dream of it," Leona replied, tucking the folder into her bag. She walked out of his office, her steps measured and calm despite the victory surging through her veins. The proof she needed, the key to saving her father's life, was finally in her hands. In the parking lot, she pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Maya. "Got it. Original report, photos, everything." Maya's response came immediately. "Get somewhere safe. Now." Leona slipped into her car, the folder secure beside her. She had what she needed, but Reynolds' threats still rang in her ears. She started the engine and pulled away from the estate, the morning sun warm on her face. The hotel room was dim, lit only by the blue glow of the laptop screen. Leona sat between Darnell and Maya, her heart pounding as they stared at the evidence that could change everything. The police report lay open beside them, its pages yellowed with age, but its truth still sharp. "Once we do this, there's no turning back," Leona said, her voice barely above a whisper. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair, exhaustion etched on her face. Darnell placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You sure about this, kid? Reynolds will come at us with everything he's got." "My father's innocent," Leona said firmly. "That's all that matters now." Maya's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "The server's secure, anonymous upload. They won't be able to trace it back to us." She looked at Leona. "Say the word." Leona took a deep breath and nodded. "Do it." Maya's fingers flew across the keys. The upload bar filled slowly. 25%, 50%, 75% complete. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Leona's phone buzzed, and buzzed again, and again. "It's starting," Darnell muttered, pulling up Twitter on his phone. The hashtag # Wallace murder was already trending. News alerts flooded their screens. On the TV mounted on the wall, breaking news banners flashed across every major network. A reporter's voice filled the room. "Breaking news. New evidence suggests Senator Wallace's son, Eric Wallace, may be responsible for the murder that sent Robert Whitmore to death row." Maya's phone rang, her editor. "They're running with it. Every major outlet picked it up." Leona's hands shook as she watched the story unfold. The governor's office released a hasty statement. "We are aware of the allegations and are looking into the matter. No further comment at this time." Then came the footage that made Leona's heart stop. Eric Wallace, face hidden behind dark sunglasses, being rushed through a private airport terminal. 2 security guards flanked him as he hurried toward a waiting jet. "He's running," Darnell growled. "Guilty men always run." The news anchor's voice grew more urgent. "Sources confirm Eric Wallace is attempting to leave the country. The FBI has been notified." Social media exploded with outrage. The story was everywhere. People demanding justice, calling for investigations, sharing Robert's story. The truth they'd fought so hard to expose was finally seeing the light. Leona stood at the window watching the city lights below. Behind her, the TV continued its endless coverage. She'd just lit a match to a powder keg, and the explosion was only beginning. "Look at this," Maya called out. On the screen, crowds were already gathering outside the governor's mansion, holding signs demanding Robert's release. Leona pressed her forehead against the cool glass. "All those years," she whispered. "All those years they knew the truth." The night wore on, and they watched as their revelation shook the city to its core. The political establishment scrambled to respond, but the truth was out there now, impossible to contain. The morning sun filtered through the hotel room curtains as Leona's phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand. Her eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, but adrenaline shot through her body as she grabbed the device. Breaking news alerts flooded her screen. Eric Wallace had been arrested at a private airstrip, but that victory felt hollow as Governor Brooks's face appeared on the TV screen. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expression stern and unyielding. "While we acknowledge the new information that has come to light," the governor announced, his voice dripping with practiced authority, "the justice system is based on due process. This new information does not undo a jury's decision." Leona's fingers curled into fists. "He knows Robert is innocent," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "He just doesn't care." She threw on her jacket and drove through the morning traffic to Maya's office. The newsroom was buzzing with activity. Reporters huddled around screens watching the governor's statement on repeat. "He won't budge," Leona announced, bursting into Maya's office where Darnell was already waiting. She paced the small space, her heels clicking against the tile floor. "We need a bigger move." Maya looked up from her computer, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept either. "The evidence is solid. Wallace's confession, the police report, it's all there. How can they ignore this?" "Because they can," Darnell said, his deep voice grave. He leaned forward in his chair, hands clasped together. "But there's one place that can overrule the governor, the Supreme Court." Leona stopped pacing. The Supreme Court. It seemed impossible, but then again, everything they'd accomplished so far had seemed impossible too. "A direct appeal to the Supreme Court," Maya mused, typing rapidly. "Based on new evidence and constitutional violations. It could work." "It has to work," Leona said firmly. "It's our last shot." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Judge Marilyn Reed, her old mentor from law school, the woman who had taught her to never back down from a fight for justice. Her finger hovered over the call button. This was it, their final play in a game where her father's life was the stakes. "I need your help," Leona said when Judge Reed answered. Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "We're taking this all the way to the top." Rain poured down in heavy sheets as Leona, Maya, and Darnell stood at the base of the Supreme Court steps. The massive building loomed above them, its white marble columns stark against the dark evening sky. Water dripped from Leona's hair, but she barely noticed. Her entire focus was on the manila folder clutched against her chest, protected from the rain by her coat. "Last chance," Darnell said quietly. "You sure about this?" Maya checked her watch. "We have less than 24 hours before—" "Don't," Leona cut her off. "Don't say it." She took a deep breath and started up the steps. 2 security guards blocked their path at the entrance. "Court's closed for the day," one said firmly. "Please," Leona pleaded, her voice cracking. "This is an emergency appeal. A man's life depends on it." The guards didn't budge. "Ma'am, you need to leave." "We have new evidence," Leona shouted, her voice echoing off the wet marble. "This is a wrongful execution." "Let them through." The commanding voice came from behind them. Judge Marilyn Reed stood there, her silver hair gleaming in the rain, holding a black umbrella. The guards hesitated. "Your Honor, protocol states—" "I said let them through." Judge Reed's tone left no room for argument. "I'll escort them myself." Inside the building, their wet shoes squeaked against the polished floor, as Judge Reed led them to the chamber where 3 Supreme Court justices waited. The room felt impossibly large, with its towering ceiling and dark wood panels. The justices' faces were unreadable as Leona presented the evidence, the confession, the police report, everything they had gathered. Minutes stretched like hours as the justices examined the documents. Leona's heart pounded so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, the Chief Justice looked up, his expression grave. "We'll deliberate on this immediately," he said. "But understand, Ms. Whitmore, time is not on your side." Leona nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. Leona stood on the steps, face turned up to the sky, letting the cold drops mix with the tears she could no longer hold back. 24 hours. Less than that now. Somewhere in a prison cell, her father was counting down those same hours, perhaps watching the same rainfall. The wet folder was still clutched in her hands, their last hope, now in the hands of the highest court in the land. But would justice come fast enough? The night pressed heavily against Leona's apartment windows as she sat cross-legged on her couch, surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups. In her trembling hands, she held a worn photograph, her father in his military uniform, proud and strong, before any of this nightmare began. Her thumb traced the edges of the picture, feeling every crease and fold. "Hold on, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just a little longer." The city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to her pain. Her phone sat silent on the coffee table, mocking her with its stillness. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, knowing that somewhere in that massive Supreme Court building, 9 justices held her father's life in their hands. The sudden buzz of her phone made her jump. Isaac's name flashed across the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. "Leona?" Isaac's voice was thick with emotion. "I was wrong. I should have supported you from the start." Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. After weeks of fighting alone, hearing those words from her brother broke something inside her. "Then help me," she pleaded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Get on live television. Tell the world what's happening. They need to hear from you, from our family." The silence on the other end stretched out. Leona held her breath, afraid she'd asked too much. Finally, Isaac spoke. "Okay," he said firmly. "I'll do it. I'll tell them everything." Leona's hands shook as she quickly outlined their plan. Isaac would use his position as a medical student to speak about the physical and emotional toll of wrongful convictions. He'd humanize their father's story, make people understand what was at stake. "I'll call Maya," Leona said, her voice stronger now. "She can get you on the evening news within the hour." "Leona?" Isaac's voice softened. "I'm sorry it took me so long to stand with you." She clutched the phone tighter, fresh tears falling. "You're here now, that's what matters." Within 30 minutes, Isaac stood in front of the cameras, his white medical coat a stark contrast against the dark night. His voice carried across the airwaves, steady and clear. "My father is a decorated war veteran who served this country with honor," he began. "In less than 12 hours, our justice system plans to execute an innocent man. My sister has fought tirelessly to expose the truth while I stood back in fear. But I can't be silent anymore. The evidence is clear. My father was framed. The real killer has been exposed. How many more families must be torn apart before we demand better from our justice system?" Leona watched from her apartment, her heart swelling with pride and hope as her brother spoke truth to power. The news anchor's eyes glistened with tears as Isaac finished his emotional plea. Social media exploded with support, the hashtag #Save Robert Whitmore trending nationwide. The Supreme Court couldn't ignore this now. The whole country was watching. The Supreme Court's waiting room felt like a tomb at 3 a.m. Leona sat rigid on the hard wooden bench, her shoulders hunched, her body screaming for rest. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed through the empty space, each second bringing them closer to either salvation or devastation. Darnell paced the floor, his footsteps matching the clock's steady beat. Maya sat beside Leona, occasionally checking her phone for updates from their team of supporters gathered outside. 27 years on the force, Darnell muttered, breaking the silence. "Never seen anything like this." Leona tried to nod, but her head felt too heavy. The world swam before her eyes, dark spots dancing in her vision. Days without proper food or rest were finally catching up to her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the paper cup of water Maya had brought her hours ago. "Stay with me, Leona," Maya whispered, steadying her friend's shaking hands. "We've come too far to break now." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. Leona's stomach cramped painfully, reminding her of how long it had been since she'd eaten a real meal. But food was the last thing on her mind. Somewhere in this building, 9 Supreme Court justices held her father's life in their hands. The clock struck 3:30 a.m. Leona's head drooped forward, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. Maya gently squeezed her shoulder, keeping her awake. Through the fog of fatigue, Leona could hear Darnell making another circuit around the room, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. "What's taking so long?" he growled, more to himself than anyone else. Leona wanted to respond, but forming words felt impossible. Her body was finally rebelling against the weeks of stress, the days of hunger striking, the endless nights of working and planning and fighting. She slumped against Maya's shoulder, her eyelids growing heavier by the second. The sound of a door opening jolted her back to consciousness. A clerk, young and serious-faced, stepped into the waiting room. The fluorescent lights gleamed off his wire-rimmed glasses as he adjusted his tie. "The justices have reached a decision," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. Leona's heart lurched. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Darnell rushed to her side, helping her up. Maya steadied her other arm. "You've got this," Maya whispered. "One more fight." The clerk waited patiently as Leona found her footing. Her head spun, but she forced herself to focus. Everything they'd fought for came down to this moment. "The Chief Justice will deliver the verdict in courtroom 1, the clerk said, gesturing toward the heavy wooden doors. Leona took a deep breath, willing strength into her trembling limbs. The marble floor felt unsteady beneath her feet as she took her first step toward the courtroom. Darnell and Maya flanked her, their presence giving her the support she desperately needed. At the courtroom doors, Leona paused. Through the polished wood, she could hear movement inside, the rustle of robes, the scrape of chairs. The fate of her father, the truth they'd fought so hard to expose, waited on the other side. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her father's words from that first terrible day. "Don't lose yourself over this, baby girl." Opening her eyes, Leona straightened her shoulders. She might have lost her career, her comfort, and nearly her health in this fight. But she hadn't lost herself. She'd found her true purpose instead. With one final breath, Leona pushed open the courtroom doors. The Supreme Court chamber felt like it was closing in on Leona as she stood before the 9 justices. Her heart hammered against her ribs. each beat a reminder that her father's life hung by a thread. The ornate room with its marble columns and rich mahogany panels seemed to pulse with tension. Justice Eleanor Gaines sat in the center, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights. Her face was unreadable as she adjusted her glasses and called the emergency session to order. The sound of her gavel echoed through the dead silent chamber. Leona's legs trembled beneath her as she watched a young clerk approach Justice Gaines with the ruling. The paper seemed to move in slow motion, each second stretching into eternity. Her father had less than 3 minutes left. Justice Gaines took the document, her eyes scanning the words. The silence in the room was deafening. Cameras clicked softly from the press section. This moment would be broadcast across the nation. After reviewing the newly presented evidence, Justice Gaines began, her voice clear and steady. The Supreme Court of the United States has reached a decision. Leona's fingers dug into the wooden table before her, her knuckles turning white. She could hear Maya's sharp intake of breath behind her, feel Darnell's presence like a steady anchor to her left. Justice Gaines lifted her eyes from the paper, scanning the packed courtroom. The death sentence of Robert Whitmore is hereby overturned. The words hit Leona like a physical force. Her legs buckled and she gripped the table harder to keep from collapsing. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom like waves. Someone in the gallery started to cry. Through the roaring in her ears, Leona heard Justice Gaines continue, her voice cutting through the chaos. The state is ordered to halt all execution proceedings immediately. The gavel cracked down again, the sound jolting Leona into action. Without a word, she spun around and bolted toward the doors. Her father was still strapped to a table, waiting for death. They had to reach him in time. Her heels clattered against the marble floor as she ran, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. The victory wasn't complete until her father was safe. She had to move faster. She had to reach him. Leona's tires screeched as she pulled into the prison parking lot. Her hands shook as she grabbed the Supreme Court ruling from the passenger seat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walls of the state penitentiary, where inside her father was being prepared for execution. She burst through the main entrance, her heart pounding against her ribs. 2 guards tried to stop her, but she pushed past them, running down the sterile corridor toward the execution chamber. Through the window, she could see prison staff preparing the room, their movements methodical and practiced. "Stop!" Leona's voice echoed off the walls. "It's over!" She thrust the Supreme Court ruling into the air, her hand trembling. The guards froze, their eyes darting between Leona and Warden Mitchell, who stood near the chamber door. The warden, a stern-faced man in his 50s, stepped forward and took the papers from Leona's outstretched hand. His eyes scanned the document, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up and gave a slight nod to his staff. "Stand down," he ordered. "Take Mr. Whitmore back to his cell." Relief flooded through Leona's body as she watched the guards lead her father away from the execution chamber. Robert looked dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. They walked him back to his cell, his steps slow and uncertain. A young prison officer approached Robert's cell with a ring of keys. His hands trembled slightly as he fitted the key into the lock. "You're a free man, Mr. Whitmore," he said softly, swinging the door open one final time. Leona couldn't hold back any longer. She rushed forward, throwing her arms around her father. His prison uniform was rough against her cheek, but she didn't care. "It's over, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're coming home." Robert's arms tightened around her and she felt his tears falling onto her shoulder. His body shook with silent sobs as 15 years of fear and hopelessness finally broke free. "My baby girl," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You really did it." The morning sun streamed through the high windows as they walked through the prison corridors one last time. Robert carried a small box containing his few possessions, some letters, a Bible, and a worn photo of Leona and Isaac as children. At the main gate, a guard handed Robert a stack of release papers to sign. His hand trembled as he wrote his name, making his signature shaky but legible. The heavy metal gate buzzed and slowly swung open. Robert Whitmore stepped out into the sunlight, blinking at its brightness. The warm rays touched his face for the first time as a free man in 15 years. He took a deep breath of fresh air, letting it fill his lungs completely. The soft glow of table lamps filled Leona's apartment as she sat across from her father in the living room. Robert Whitmore looked smaller somehow in regular clothes, a simple blue sweater and khaki pants that Isaac had brought over. His fingers kept brushing against the soft fabric, as if he couldn't quite believe he was wearing something other than a prison uniform. Leona watched him take in the room, his eyes moving from the bookshelf to the window, then down to the carpet. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. The silence felt heavy, filled with 15 years of lost moments. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the cup of tea she'd made him. He took a careful sip, then set it back down with deliberate care. His movements were measured, cautious, habits formed from years of watching his every move behind bars. "I never wanted you to suffer for me," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. His eyes met hers, filled with a father's pain. Leona shook her head, feeling tears well up. "I had no choice," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They were going to kill you for something you didn't do. I couldn't just—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the memory of those desperate days. The silence stretched between them again, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. Robert's face softened, and suddenly he let out a small chuckle. "You were always so stubborn," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Even as a little girl, once you set your mind to something." Leona laughed through her tears, the sound catching her by surprise. "Wonder where I got that from?" Robert smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger, more like the father she remembered from before. He glanced around the apartment again, but this time his gaze was steadier. "It's going to take some getting used to," he admitted. "Being here, being ... He struggled with the word. "Free," Leona finished for him. She reached across the coffee table and placed her hand over his. "You're not just free, Dad," she said softly. "You're finally seen. The whole world knows the truth now." Robert's fingers curled around hers, holding on tight. In that quiet moment, father and daughter sat together, beginning the long journey of healing, of learning how to be a family again. Sunlight streamed through Leona's bedroom window, but it was the constant buzz of voices outside that woke her. She stumbled to the window, pulling back the curtain to find at least 24 reporters camped on her front lawn, cameras and microphones at the ready. Her phone rang, Darnell's name flashing on the screen. She answered, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You did it, Whitmore," his gruff voice came through. "But don't think they're letting this slide." Leona's hand froze mid-stretch. "What do you mean?" "Meet me at Joe's Diner, 30 minutes. The diner was nearly empty when Leona walked in, the bell above the door chiming softly. Darnell sat in a corner booth, a newspaper spread out in front of him. His face was grim as she slid into the seat across from him. Without a word, he turned the paper toward her. The headline made her stomach drop. "Robert Whitmore freed, but at what cost?" "They're painting you as a vigilante who undermined the justice system," Darnell said quietly. "Senator Reynolds is quoted saying your actions set a dangerous precedent." Leona scanned the article, her jaw tightening. "They're trying to discredit everything we uncovered." "That's not all." Darnell leaned forward. "My contacts say there's talk of retaliation. These men don't like losing, Leona. And you didn't just beat them, you humiliated them." Her phone buzzed. Maya's name appeared on the screen. "Leona." Maya's voice was tense. "I think you're in danger. I just got word that Reynolds and his people are planning something." Leona's heart quickened. She looked around the diner, suddenly aware of every person in the room. A man reading a newspaper, a couple having breakfast, a waitress wiping down tables. Any of them could be watching her. "What kind of something?" she asked Maya, keeping her voice low. "I don't know yet, but they're not done with you. Not by a long shot." Leona hung up, her hands trembling slightly as she set the phone down. Darnell watched her closely. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but her eyes kept scanning the diner. Every shadow seemed darker now, every stranger a potential threat. The victory she'd fought so hard for suddenly felt hollow in the face of this new danger. "We should go," Darnell said, throwing some cash on the table. "Stay at my place tonight. It's safer than your apartment right now." Leona stood, her legs unsteady. As they walked to the door, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back, watching, waiting. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe windows as Leona sat across from Ethan Crane. The familiar scent of coffee and pastries filled the air, but she couldn't bring herself to order anything. Her stomach was in knots. Ethan looked different now, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more hesitant. He drummed his fingers on the manila folder in front of him, avoiding her eyes. "You need to see this," he said finally, sliding the folder across the wooden table. Leona stared at it for a long moment before reaching out. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a legal document, typed in crisp black letters. As she scanned the contents, her breath caught in her throat. Her name appeared on a blacklist, a comprehensive ban from nearly every major law firm in the state. "They moved fast," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the quiet cafe chatter. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Ethan asked, studying her face. Leona clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening on the paper. "I didn't expect them to be this blatant." Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. "You exposed powerful people, Leona, and they don't forgive." She closed the folder, pushing it away as if it might burn her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another message from Isaac. She pulled it out, hope flickering briefly before dying as she read his words. "You saved Dad, but you destroyed everything else." The message stung more than the blacklist. She'd known the professional consequences would come, but losing her brother's support cut deeper than any career setback. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan asked, genuine concern in his voice. Leona gathered her things, standing up slowly. Her legs felt heavy, weighted down by the reality of her situation. "What I've always done. Keep fighting." She walked to the cafe's exit, pausing by the large front window. Her reflection stared back at her. Still wearing her expensive suit, still looking every bit the successful lawyer she'd been just weeks ago. But everything had changed. She'd given up her career, her reputation, even her relationship with Isaac, all for justice. The sunlight caught her face in the glass, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her jaw. She stood there, wondering if it had been enough, if saving her father was worth the price she'd paid. The weight of the sacrifices pressed down on her shoulders as she pushed open the door and stepped out into the afternoon light. The fluorescent lights of Johnson's grocery buzzed overhead as Robert Whitmore stood motionless in aisle 3. His eyes darted from shelf to shelf, taking in the endless array of bread choices. Whole wheat, white, sourdough, rye. Each brand offering multiple varieties. The packaging screamed with bright colors and bold promises. Leona watched from near the shopping carts, her heart aching. Her father looked so small in his borrowed jacket, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. In prison, choices were limited. Breakfast was breakfast. Bread was bread. But here, in this ordinary grocery store, freedom meant facing hundreds of small decisions. An elderly woman squeezed past Robert with her cart, giving him a strange look. He pressed himself against the shelves to let her through, his hands trembling slightly. "Can I help you find something specific?" A young cashier approached, her name tag reading Jenny. She offered a friendly smile. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. His fingers clenched and unclenched at his sides. Without warning, he turned and walked quickly toward the exit, nearly knocking over a display of potato chips. "Dad!" Leona hurried after him, following him outside into the morning sunshine. She found him sitting on a wooden bench, his head in his hands. His breathing came in short, sharp bursts. "I don't know how to be free," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Everything's too bright, too loud, too much." Leona sat beside him, careful not to touch him until he was ready. The morning traffic rolled past, and a cool breeze rustled through the nearby trees. "It's going to take time, Dad," she said softly. "You've been locked up for 15 years. You don't have to figure it all out today." Robert lifted his head slowly, his eyes red-rimmed. "In there, I knew what to expect every minute of every day. Out here." He gestured vaguely at the world around them. "I don't even know how to buy bread anymore." "Then we'll learn together," Leona replied. "We can start small. Maybe just one type of bread today. Tomorrow we can try something else." Robert's weathered hand found hers, gripping it tightly. "You gave me my life back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know what to do with it yet." The sleek office building towered over downtown as Leona's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Ms. Whitmore? This is Lisa Harrington from Global Media Networks." The voice was polished, professional. "We're interested in producing a documentary series about your father's case." Leona's grip tightened on her phone. "I'm listening." "This could be huge. Prime-time streaming deals, the works. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation." Hours later, Leona and Robert sat in Lisa's corner office, surrounded by industry awards and framed magazine covers. Lisa gestured animatedly as she outlined her vision. "Think about it. A man wrongly convicted, a daughter who never gave up, corruption at the highest levels." Lisa's eyes gleamed. "We're talking multiple episodes, dramatic reenactments, exclusive interviews. The public needs to hear this story." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. His voice was quiet, but firm. "I'm not a story. I'm a man. Those 15 years weren't entertainment. They were my life." Lisa pressed on, sliding a contract across her glass desk. "With your story, we could shed light on systemic injustice. Think of the impact, and the compensation would be significant." She named a figure that made Leona's breath catch, but looking at her father's face, she knew money couldn't heal what had been broken. "No," Leona said firmly, standing up. "We won't let you turn our pain into prime-time drama." That evening, exhausted from the meeting, Leona opened her laptop to find an email waiting. "Dear Ms. Whitmore, my name is Angela Ross. My son Marcus has been in prison for 8 years for a murder he didn't commit. The evidence was circumstantial, the police work sloppy. I saw what you did for your father. Please, can you help my boy? He doesn't deserve to die in there. Angela." Attached were court documents, witness statements, and a photo of a young man in a graduation gown, smiling with his mother. Leona stared at the screen, her heart heavy with the weight of another family's desperation. She recognized that same pain, that same fierce need for justice that had driven her for so long. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her response. She was exhausted, blacklisted, still trying to help her father adjust to freedom. But Angela's words echoed in her mind. "He doesn't deserve to die in there." The cursor blinked steadily on the screen as Leona sat in her dimly lit apartment, Angela's plea for help waiting for an answer. The evening air hung heavy as Leona and Robert pulled away from Mario's Italian restaurant. Robert had barely touched his pasta, still adjusting to real food after years of prison meals. Leona kept glancing in her rearview mirror, a habit she'd developed over the past few days. That's when she noticed it, a black SUV 3 cars back matching their every turn. "Dad," she said quietly, "don't look back, but I think we're being followed." Robert's shoulders tensed, but he kept facing forward. "How long?" "Since we left the restaurant." Leona made a sudden right turn. The SUV followed. She took another right. Again, it stayed with them. Her heart pounded as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. The SUV's headlights loomed in her mirror, growing closer. She pressed the accelerator, weaving through traffic, but the vehicle stayed on their tail. "They're not even trying to hide it," Robert muttered, his voice tight with worry. Leona's mind raced. She couldn't lead them home, couldn't risk a confrontation on a dark street. Then she spotted the bright lights of a 24-hour gas station ahead, its security cameras clearly visible. Without signaling, she pulled into the well-lit parking lot, positioning her car directly under the largest camera. The black SUV cruised past, engine revving as it disappeared into the darkness. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text message appeared. You should have stopped when you won, now we're watching. Leona showed the message to Robert. Their eyes met, understanding passing between them. The victory they'd celebrated just days ago suddenly felt hollow. They're still coming after us, Leona said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. Robert reached over and squeezed her hand. The same hands that had comforted her as a child now trembled slightly. You don't have to keep fighting, baby girl. You've done enough. But Leona's jaw clenched as she stared into the darkness where the SUV had vanished. Let them come. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Judge Marilyn Reed's downtown office, casting long shadows across the expensive Persian rug. Leona sat in a plush leather chair, her shoulders tense as she faced her former mentor. Judge Reed's silver hair gleamed in the light as she sipped her Earl Grey tea, her keen eyes studying Leona over the rim of the delicate china cup. I've been blacklisted from every law firm in the country, Leona said, her voice tight. What do I do now? Judge Reed set her teacup down with a gentle clink. I can offer you a way back in, Leona, but it comes with a cost. The older woman pulled out a thick folder from her desk drawer. Carlson & White. They're one of the biggest corporate law firms in the country. They handle Fortune 500 companies, political elites. The works. She slid the folder across her massive oak desk. They're willing to take you on as senior counsel. Full benefits, corner office, 7-figure salary. Leona's fingers brushed the folder's edge. What's the catch? You leave the wrongful conviction cases behind, Judge Reed said firmly. No more crusades, no more protests. You focus on corporate law, nothing else. We'll protect you from the people who are threatening you. Leona's jaw tightened. You want me to forget what happened to my father? To ignore the truth? The world moves on, Leona, Judge Reed sighed, leaning back in her chair. Your fight is over. You won. Your father is free. Now it's time to think about your future. My future? Leona stood up, her voice sharp. What about all the other innocent people still trapped in prison? What about their futures? You can't save everyone, Leona. Sometimes you have to choose between doing good and doing well. Then I'm done with it. Leona turned away from the desk. I won't abandon what I believe in for a corner office. You're making a mistake, Judge Reed called after her. This system will crush you if you keep fighting it. Leona paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Maybe, but at least I'll be fighting for what's right. She walked out of the office, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The morning sun felt warmer now, more purposeful. She might have lost her prestigious career, but she'd found something more valuable, her true calling. I'm not walking away from this, she whispered to herself as she stepped into the elevator. I'll fight for what's right no matter what. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 2:17 a.m. when Robert jolted awake, his t-shirt soaked with sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stumbled into the living room, the phantom sensation of leather straps still tight around his wrists. The moonlight filtering through the curtains cast strange shadows that made him flinch. He paced back and forth, his bare feet silent on the carpet, trying to shake off the vivid memory of the execution chamber. The cold metal table, the needles, the clock ticking down his final moments. Leona appeared in the doorway holding a glass of water. Her dark hair was messy from sleep, concern etched on her face. You okay? Robert nodded mechanically, but couldn't meet her eyes. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. I keep thinking I'm still in there, still about to die. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Robert's hands trembled as he ran them over his face. This is all my fault. Everything you've lost. Your career, your reputation, your brother. He shook his head, shoulders slumping. I should have just let them kill me. You wouldn't have to go through all this. Something sparked in Leona's eyes, a fierce, burning light that made her whole body straighten. You think your life isn't worth fighting for? Her voice cracked with emotion. Why do you think I spent every day fighting for you, Dad? Why do you think I didn't stop? Tears spilled down her cheeks as she crossed the room in quick strides, grabbing his hands in hers. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. I fought because I believe in you, because I believe you deserve to live, because I love you. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. His carefully constructed walls, built over 15 years of prison, of trying to stay strong, of accepting his fate, crumbled all at once. A sob tore from his throat, raw and broken. "I'm so sorry." He collapsed into her arms, his large frame shaking with years of suppressed grief and guilt. Leona held him tight, her own tears falling freely now. They stood there in the dim living room, father and daughter, both emotionally spent but finally able to truly see and understand each other. Their embrace said everything words couldn't, about sacrifice, about love, about the unbreakable bond between them that had survived prison walls, corrupt systems, and even death row. In that moment, they weren't lawyer and client or even father and daughter. They were just two people who had fought impossible odds together and won. Leona held Robert close, feeling his tears soak through her shoulder, knowing that this breakdown was part of healing. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but at least now they could face it together, with nothing left unsaid between them. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the conference center as Leona straightened her navy blazer. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, steadying herself. The room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers packed every available space. Behind her, the crisp white banner stretched across the stage. Leona Whitmore, a fighter for the wrongfully convicted. She could feel Robert's presence in the back of the room, standing quietly with Isaac. They had finally begun to heal as a family. Leona approached the podium, adjusting the microphone. Camera flashes erupted like lightning. She cleared her throat, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "For too long, the justice system has failed those who have been wrongfully convicted," she began, her words measured and firm. "I spent my career defending the guilty, but no more. I'm done." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I will fight for the ones like my father, who have been forgotten by the system." The room fell silent as she continued. "Today I'm announcing the creation of the Whitmore Justice Initiative." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "We will take on the cases that others won't touch, the ones the system wants to bury." Questions exploded from the crowd. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting over each other. "Ms. Whitmore, how will you fund this initiative? What about the threats against your family? Do you fear retaliation from powerful figures?" Leona raised her hand, and remarkably, the chaos subsided. "The truth doesn't wait," she declared, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Neither will I." The room erupted again, but Leona maintained her composure. She could see Maya in the corner, nodding approvingly. Darnell stood by the exit, arms crossed, a slight smile on his face. As questions continued to fly, Leona addressed them one by one, her responses clear and unwavering. She outlined her plans for the initiative, how they would select cases, their approach to investigation, their commitment to transparency. Several reporters noted the boldness of her move, especially given the recent threats. One asked if she was afraid. Leona looked directly into the nearest camera, her expression resolute. "Fear is what keeps injustice alive," she responded. "I'm done being afraid." When the last question was answered, Leona gathered her papers from the podium. The crowd continued shouting questions, but she had said what she needed to say. With her head held high, she walked off the stage and through the crowd of reporters, their cameras still flashing. She pushed through the heavy conference room doors, leaving the chaos behind. In the quiet hallway, she took her first deep breath since starting the press conference. She knew this was just the beginning of a new fight, but now she had a clear purpose, a mission that would give meaning to everything she and her family had endured. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Leona and Robert stood outside the modest brick building. Their new office space wasn't fancy, just a small suite on the second floor with worn carpet and slightly faded walls. But to Leona, it was perfect. Robert held out a small wooden box, his hands steady now after a week of freedom. "For the ones the system threw away," he said softly, opening the lid to reveal a gleaming brass plaque. Leona ran her fingers over the engraved letters. "Whitmore Justice Initiative." Her throat tightened with emotion. This wasn't just a law office. It was a promise to everyone who had been forgotten and abandoned by the justice system. "Let's make it official," she said, taking out a screwdriver. The metal felt cool against her palm as she carefully mounted the plaque on the door. Each turn of the screw felt deliberate, meaningful. Robert watched her work, his eyes glistening. When she finished, they both stepped back to admire it. The morning sun caught the brass, making it shine like a beacon of hope. "I'm proud of you, Leona," Robert said, squeezing her shoulder. His voice carried the weight of everything they'd been through: the trial, the protests, the desperate fight for justice. Leona smiled, covering his hand with hers. "We're just getting started, Dad." Inside, the office was sparse but clean. A few second-hand desks, some filing cabinets, and a coffee maker that had seen better days. But the windows were large, flooding the space with natural light. Leona had insisted on that. No more darkness, no more shadows. The phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the quiet morning. Leona glanced at Robert, then walked to her desk. This was it, their first call. She picked up the receiver, her voice clear and confident. "Hello, Whitmore Justice Initiative. How can we help you?" On the other end, a woman's voice trembled with hope. Her son had been in prison for 8 years for a crime she swore he didn't commit. The evidence was flimsy, the trial rushed. She had nowhere else to turn. As Leona listened, taking notes, she felt a deep sense of purpose settle over her. This was why she'd sacrificed everything: her career, her reputation, her safety. Not just for her father, but for every person who had been crushed by a broken system. Robert sat across from her, watching with quiet pride as she worked. He knew better than anyone what it meant to be forgotten by justice, to have hope slowly stripped away year after year. When the call ended, Leona stood and walked to the window. The city stretched out below, full of stories waiting to be uncovered, wrongs waiting to be righted. She turned back to the office, their office, and closed the door behind her. Looking at the plaque one last time, she whispered to herself, "They tried to silence me. They tried to kill my father. But justice has a way of finding the light, even in the darkest places." If you enjoyed the story of Leona, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.